With all the love that's out there for the Toyota Corolla and Honda Civic, it's easy to forget that Nissan's been at the compact sedan thing for a long time too. But it's been 38 years since the Sentra first went on sale, making it one of the longest running names in the segment. Now it's new for 2020 and it's better than ever. Look, I'm not going to sit here and say that this thing is ready to dethrone the Civic and Corolla right out of the gate, but it is a way better car than the one that it replaces. Seriously, that last generation Sentra, it was one of the biggest disappointments of the last 5 years for me. It was the definition of a rental car special, but this one feels like a massive step forward in every way imaginable. And everything about it is new, from the engine under the hood to the platform it's built on. And I'll tell you one thing, one way it is far superior than just about everything else in this segment, and almost as good as that Toyota Corolla, is the ride quality. That platform goes a long way in making one of the best riding cars in the compact car segment today. It's also got an independent rear suspension instead of a torsion beam setup for the first time in a few generations, and it goes a long way in improving this ride. Essentially, a torsion beam is the easy way out, and you see it in a lot of economy cars. It uses a crossmember that connects the rear wheels instead of an independent suspension, and since they're connected, it's just generally a lot harsher. But since this thing uses a multi-link setup, it's got a bunch of different components at each wheel, and it helps to isolate harshness. So if you hit a bump with the left wheel, it's going to stay isolated to that side of the car. And I'm not saying it's perfect, but it is vastly improved over the last version and a lot better than other cars in this segment. The Corolla really is the top of the class, but this one doesn't feel that far off. And it really is this wheel and tire combination on this SR Premium version I'm driving that leads to most of the harshness you're feeling in here. And it really is just a lot of cracks and bumps in the road, minor stuff. And if you had something with a taller sidewall, you wouldn't feel it as much. I really do enjoy this ride quite a bit. If I had to describe this Sentra in a word, it would be composed. And if you're using this as a commuter out on the highway, you're really going to appreciate the way it operates. There's a lot of heft to it, but that doesn't mean it's heavy. It just feels very solid, but it's also very pliable and very manageable. And the same goes with the steering. It's a lot like that Nissan Kicks I reviewed last week. There's good weight and resistance to it, but there's not much feel. And steering feel doesn't necessarily mean sporty, it can mean safe too. Because if you have a sense of which direction the wheels are pointed, you're going to be a safer driver in the event of an evasive maneuver. Yeah, it helps when you're trying to have fun, but when safety is paramount, you do want to know which way the wheels are pointing and when. And without that steering feel, you're not necessarily going to know what's happening. But that's not necessarily a knock on this thing, it's just something I'd like to see more of. But again, it's just very well composed. It's got a lot of weight and resistance to the steering and a lot of heft to the ride, and that's something I appreciate a lot in a car like this. And speaking of safety, Nissan is really going after the segment leaders when it comes to the advanced safety stuff you can get in the Sentra. There's automatic emergency braking up front with pedestrian detection, blind spot monitoring with rear cross traffic alert, automatic high beams. There's even automatic reverse braking, which is really cool in a car like this. Now, one thing to point out is that there's lane departure warning instead of lane keep assist, so that's one way it falls behind cars like the Civic and Corolla, which include that as standard equipment. And the same goes with adaptive cruise control. You can't get it in the base Sentra, and it does come in the base versions of those cars, but every other trim does get adaptive cruise, so it's really only lane keep assist that you're missing out on. Otherwise, it is a very well-equipped car right from the base model, which I love to see in this segment. There's also 10 airbags in this thing and a government-mandated backup camera, but just like that Kicks, it's pretty dark and low res. And the same goes with the surround view system you get in this top trim I'm driving. It just doesn't look all that great on this touchscreen. Either way though, you're really going to appreciate having those views when you're backing this thing into a parking space, because the view out the back isn't all that great. Really, it's a twofold problem back here. First up, you've got these 3 fixed headrests across the back that are hard to ignore when you look in the mirror, and on top of that, the parcel shelf sits really high, so it ends up pinching the window. But if there was a silver lining back here, it would be that this trunk is absolutely massive. But best of all, the opening is really wide too, and this is one of the smallest cars I've ever been able to fit Patty, our pedal car, in without having to play a game of Tetris first. You can also fold down the back seats if you want, and they have a 60-40 split for some extra utility, but obviously this thing isn't quite as practical as a crossover like the Kicks. If you're shopping for something small and commuter friendly and you're looking at a Nissan with about 20 to 30 grand to spend, it's really going to come down to this thing or the Kicks. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about that since I just reviewed it last week. So if you didn't watch the review, make sure you check it out after this and subscribe. But really what it comes down to are their fundamental differences. Because yeah, the Kicks is a little bit more versatile and roomier inside for both people and stuff, but this is the way better car to drive. And it also feels like the more expensive of the two. And I don't just mean because this SR Premium trim is the most expensive of the two you can buy. It's about 2,000 bucks more than the most expensive Kicks, but it feels even pricier than that in the quality of the ride and this interior. I can't get over just how nice this space is amongst all compact cars. Nissan has really hit the ball out of the park with this one. Now, obviously, Nissan's thrown everything the Sentra has to offer in this SR Premium trim, and I'm not so crazy about this synthetic leather upholstery. It doesn't even feel as nice as the stuff you can get in the Kicks. But just in terms of the overall vibe in here, it is very nice, and it has a bit of a premium vibe to it. Not that you're going to mistake it for something like the Mercedes A-Class, but it is very nice, and it's all the simple stuff, like these HVAC vents down here underneath this touchscreen. They just give it a really nice look. And the same goes with all this orange accent stitching. I wasn't so crazy about it in the Kicks, but it looks really nice in this Sentra. And it works really well with this orange exterior color and this black roof that you can get on the SR or SR Premium trims. Let's talk about this infotainment system for a second, because obviously it's a pretty big centerpiece of this cabin. And I will say the 8-inch unit that you get in all but the base trims is very nice to use. It's bright, crisp, and responsive. I'm not so crazy about Nissan's interface itself, and it feels kind of incomplete to me, but as long as you're getting this 8-inch screen, you are getting Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, and there are USB-A and USB-C ports to hook up to it. Now, one thing I will point out is that even in this top trim, you don't get an integrated navigation system. That won't be such a big deal if you're like me and you prefer Google Maps anyway, but it is something worth pointing out because just about every competitor does include a built-in navigation system in its top trim. So Nissan's kind of ahead of the curve in terms of cutting that from its offerings. But again, the system isn't all that great anyways, and I find either one of those smartphone pairing systems are way easier to use anyway. Only SR models get a heated steering wheel, but as long as you don't buy the base, you do get heated seats in this thing. And I'm not sold on all the zero gravity hype around Nissan seats, but I do have to admit that after driving this thing for a few hours straight the other day, this driver's seat is pretty comfortable. There's not much contouring and the seat backs are pretty flat, but even still, it's a pretty cozy place to be. And after driving it for a few hours, I'd give it a pass, especially as far as compact car seats go. No, they're not as comfortable as the ones you get in the Volkswagen Golf, but they are pretty good even with this synthetic leather. Now, as you can see, I am just on the verge of being too tall for this cabin with this sunroof. I barely have enough headroom, but I do find it pretty comfortable. It's worse in the back seat though, and I don't have enough room because of how the roof slopes. But I would say that anyone up to about 6 feet will fit back there no problem. And just generally speaking, the cabin is pretty roomy for a car this size. And that finally brings me to what's under the hood of this 2020 Sentra. And that really was a big disappointment about the last version. I know you could get the SR Turbo, but even that wasn't a very good powertrain. And then the base 1.8 liter was downright terrible, but Nissan has wisely swapped it out for a version of the 2 liter from the Qashqai. And on paper, it still looks pretty underwhelming, but if you look at this Sentra for the economy car that it is, instead of the one you think it should be, it's perfectly fine. There's 149 horsepower and 145 pound-feet of torque to work with. Not outstanding, but more than enough for the daily grind and more than enough to keep up with the average car in this class. And the same goes with the continuously variable transmission that's mated to this engine. It does a decent job of what it needs to do. You know, I have had complaints about Nissan CVTs in the past, but it finally seems like the automaker has cracked the riddle. No, this thing's not going to win you any races, and yeah, it can be pretty loud and buzzy at times, but for the most part, it'll do what it needs to do, and as far as smooth acceleration goes, it is more than up to the task, and that to me is all a car like this needs to do. One thing I will say though is I do wish it had paddle shifters. No, I don't mean for some sort of sporty, playful drive, but those things are great when it's time to pass or merge on the highway. You can drop down one of those simulated gears and it just gives you a little bit more throttle response. This doesn't have that at all, and it doesn't have a sport mode either. All you have is an eco mode that you activate through this button down here on the dash. But again, for the most part, this powertrain is up to the job of the daily grind of what a commuter car needs to do. If I had one complaint about this engine though, it's that there's this really awkward metallic purring noise that I notice at moderate throttle. If you have the radio off, you'll really notice it, so make sure to check that out on your test drive. Fuel consumption's not bad either. Nissan says this thing should burn just over 7 liters per 100 kilometers combined, and I've almost nailed that this week, and that's included quite a bit of city driving with a little bit of highway mixed in. That's competitive with the Civic and Corolla. And this thing's competitive with the Civic and Corolla when it comes to pricing too. Now let's forget about the base model, because just like most automakers, Nissan really uses that in advertising to suck you in the first place. But that car that's advertised for about 19 grand, well, it's got a manual transmission, which I doubt many of you want, and it doesn't have heated seats or Apple CarPlay and Android Auto running through its infotainment system, so it is a pretty stripped down car. Though at least it does have power locks and windows as well as air conditioning. But really what you're going to want is the SV, SR, or SR Premium trims, because that's where the good stuff comes in. If you're looking at the Sentra SV, it's about 22 grand before fees and taxes, so about the same as an equivalent Corolla and a few grand less than a similar Civic. And that's about the same as a Kicks SV as well, if that's what you're cross-shopping it against. And most of the equipment you get in it is decent for the money. You get heated front seats, that 8-inch touchscreen, Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, there's even alloy wheels. But really, I think the SR and SR Premium trims are where it's at with this thing, and not just because of this two-tone exterior color you can get, but there is some really great stuff in here. Both of those top trims are also where you're going to notice the Sentra getting seriously cheaper than the competition. If you look at a Corolla XLE, that thing's about $1,000 more than this SR Premium version I'm driving, which is priced at about 26 grand before extras. If you look at the Civic Touring, that thing is $29,000 before freight and fees, so quite a bit more money. If you're looking at the Sentra SR or the Kicks SR, they're priced at about the same, so 24 grand before fees and taxes, if that's what you're cross-shopping this thing against. But again, this thing is going to feel like it's delivering a lot more value for the money. To recap, I like the new Sentra's refined drive, segment-leading interior, and standard safety equipment. I don't like that you can't get it with lane keep assist, the limited visibility out the back, and the low-res backup camera. The Civic and Corolla have definitely earned their reputation for reliability, and I'm not here to take away from that at all. But there's something to be said about a car that's been around for nearly 40 years in a segment that's dominated by the two cars at the top. This new version of the Sentra is also vastly improved over the one that came before it, with some serious style and great features, all at a pretty reasonable price. Just like anything, you've got to pick the car that's right for you, but if you're shopping for a small sedan, this new Sentra might just fit the bill and keep you under budget.